So now that you've had a chance to see me reading this paper, though of course not reading it in huge depth, because this piece of work would certainly take a lot more time than even that speeded up sense you were given. But what I might do is just explain some of my process, and then that might help you think about your own process. So for example, I began by looking at the abstract. And if you remember, I wanted to read this piece to help me understand Morton Robinson's later work on the white possessive. So I underlined here the fact that it is a work in progress. And so yes, this is the right paper to read to help me understand. Now in terms of all my questions and answers, the first thing I did of course was what Roland Barthes called cruising the text. You saw me just flick through all the pages. I was just trying to get a sense of where it went, what it covered by looking at the headings, etc. Then when I came to read it, what I wanted to do was read particular sections. I wanted to read the sections where Morton Robinson had applied Foucault's work and appropriated it for her own work. So that was what interested me much more than the description of what Foucault had done, for example. So I also, as I went through, I make a map in the margins about how the paper is structured so that I can return to this. And one thing I noticed here is that I always pay attention to the overview. Now many articles, and I failed to mention this in the anatomy, have a paragraph which is essentially a map of the paper. So they explain exactly what's going to be done where and when, and you can go back to that to see how this paper works. I also wanted to note here that this is where she talked, for example, about her own influences that I might follow up. And I'm interested to be able to find quickly later where she begins to talk about the Australian context, so I marked that. Much of this, as I said before, is a discussion of Foucault's work, which is not quite so central to me now. What I wanted to focus on was her own research agenda, which she has really nicely marked out with an appropriate heading, toward a research agenda. And I've noted here, these are her questions now. Then as I was reading that, it occurred to me that though she asks a number of questions, two of them are going to be central to my own analysis of Andrew Forrest's work. And so those two questions I've underlined here, and in my notes, I've made a note that on page 389, for example, and 388, those two questions could be used as I begin to analyse Twiggy Forrest's actions. I could think about the terrain of sovereignty, and I could think about rationality. Then down here she has a group of other questions which she argues define white possession. Now I looked at those questions and I wasn't really that interested in them till I got to the bit here that said those questions are important to the definition of white possession. And then when I went back to the questions, I could see some ways in which I could apply that also to my own case study and use that to think about her argument too. Then flicking through some of this, I found then that I could come towards the end of the piece and think a little bit about her suggestions for the ways in which Foucault's work can be rethought through her own. Interestingly though, she does talk about textual analysis of media representations, which is what I'm going to do, so I wanted to make a note of that. But most importantly was the reference to national identity. And this last bit really only stood out as I was scanning through there. And of course, that's going to be a central element for any examination of resource allocation. And then of course, I paid a little bit more attention to the conclusion, a quick cursory look at the references and my notes here. The next stage for me would be then to know I am going to use this in depth. I would read it more thoroughly, and when I read it next time, I will actually be typing my analysis. Big tip there, read and write at the same time.